The year was 1877, and the prairie was a vast, unforgiving sea of grass that had swallowed Amos Blackwood's hope whole. His farm was a small, desperate island in its midst, the clapboard house leaning like a man tired of standing, the barn a skeleton of weathered grey planks. A year had passed since the silence had descended, a quiet so profound it had its own weight, pressing down on him from the moment the sun bled over the horizon to the instant it bruised into nightfall. It was the silence left behind by Martha and the child she had taken with her into the cold, unforgiving earth beside the lone cottonwood tree. Amos moved through his days like a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. His grief was not a sharp, wailing thing. It was a dull, permanent ache in his bones, a constant companion in the empty chair across the small kitchen table. He still spoke to her, his voice a low murmur against the ceaseless wind. "Ground's getting hard, Martha," he'd say, looking out the window at the fields that had once been their shared dream. Now they were just acres of dirt that demanded a sweat and blood he no longer felt he had. He was a man hollowed out, left with only the shell of routine: wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Loneliness was a physical presence in the small house. It was in the single cup he washed each morning, the untouched side of the corn-husk mattress, the echo of his own footsteps on the floorboards. The land itself seemed to feel it, offering up only stubborn roots and thirsty soil. His neighbors, the closest a half-day's ride away, were folk as hardened as the land they worked, with little time for another man's sorrow. They saw him at the general store in the distant settlement, a gaunt figure with eyes that looked through people rather than at them, and they kept their distance. He was a man drowning, and no one had a rope to spare. He had survived the summer on meager harvests and the last of their salted pork. But now, autumn was bleeding its colors across the plains, a beautiful, cruel reminder that winter was coming. The wind had a new edge to it, a promise of ice and isolation. In the corner of the barn, a place he tried not to look at for too long, sat the sum of his entire future, a single, fat bag of seed corn. It was the best of last year's crop, saved with a reverence that bordered on worship. It was everything. It was the promise of a spring planting, the only thing standing between him and total ruin. Without it, this farm, this life, this last tether to his memories of Martha, would be lost forever. The bag was his last prayer, his final, desperate wager against the wilderness. One afternoon, as a sky the color of a lead coffin stretched overhead, he saw them. They were just figures at first, shimmering in the distance where the prairie met his tilled land. Not riders, but people on foot, moving with a slow, exhausted deliberation. As they drew closer, his hand went instinctively to the old rifle resting by the door. Tense encounters were the bitter folklore of the frontier, tales told in hushed tones around pot-bellied stoves. He watched, his body rigid, as the small group resolved into a man, a woman, and a small child. They were Cheyenne, he guessed from their dress. The man walked in front, straight-backed and proud, but Amos could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. The child, a boy no older than 5, clung to his father's leg, his large, dark eyes fixed on the farmhouse with a mixture of fear and curiosity. But it was the woman who held Amos's gaze, who made the air in his lungs turn to stone. She was heavy with child, her steps a painful shuffle through the dry stubble of his harvested field. Her face was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. She leaned on the man for support, and with every step, Amos saw a weakness that spoke of days, maybe weeks, without sustenance. They stopped a respectful distance from the porch. The man, whose name was Mocha Tavato, did not speak. He simply stood there, his presence a silent, desperate plea. His gaze was steady, not begging, but stating a fact as plain and harsh as the land itself. They were starving. Amos's mind screamed at him, "Send them away. You have nothing. You have less than nothing. You have a bag of seed and a winter to survive." The prejudice of the age, the fear and suspicion that poisoned the very air between settlers and the native peoples, whispered its venom in his ear. But then he looked at the woman again, Vivina. He saw the weary slope of her shoulders, the protective hand resting on her swollen belly. And the wall around his heart, the one he had built stone by grieving stone, cracked. He saw Martha. He saw her in that last week, her body weary but her eyes bright with the promise of the life she carried. He felt the phantom pain of that loss, a physical blow that knocked the breath from him. The rifle by the door suddenly felt obscene in its uselessness. What threat was this? This was not a raid. This was a family on the brink of erasure. "Go away," Amos said, his voice rough from disuse, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He did not mean them. He knew it the moment they left his lips. Moketavato did not move. His eyes flickered to his wife, a universe of worry and love in that one small glance. He said nothing. He did not have to. Their shared humanity, stripped bare of all pretense, hung in the cold air between them. They were two men, two fathers, standing on opposite sides of a chasm of culture and history, but united in that moment by the universal terror of being unable to provide, unable to protect. Amos felt a war rage within him. His mind, practical and terrified, screamed about the seed corn. It was his survival. It was the only logical thing to protect. But his heart, that long dormant and wounded thing, saw Martha's face in the Cheyenne woman's exhausted eyes. What was survival if it meant becoming a man who could watch a child starve? What was a future worth if it was built on the ghost of a woman he turned away? He would be truly alone then, haunted not just by grief, but by a shame that would be colder than any winter. He turned without another word and walked back into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind him. He could feel their eyes on his back. He walked through the kitchen, past the empty chair, and went straight to the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and dust and failure. There it was in the corner, the bag. It seemed to glow in the dim light, a beacon of everything he was about to throw away. He hefted it onto his shoulder. It was heavy, heavy with corn, heavy with dreams, heavy with the future. He walked back out onto the porch, the weight of the bag a painful pressure on his shoulder. He did not stop at the steps. He walked right out to where they stood, the dust puffing up around his worn boots. He stopped in front of Moketavato. He looked from the man's stoic face to his wife's, and then down to the small, frightened boy. He said nothing. He simply swung the bag from his shoulder and lowered it to the ground between them. It landed with a soft, final thud. Moketavato stared at the bag. He looked up at Amos, his eyes wide with a disbelief so profound it was almost painful to witness. He seemed to be searching for a trick, a hidden price. He found none in Amos's gaze. Amos just gave a slight, tired nod, a gesture that said, "Take it, it's done." Slowly, as if in a dream, Moketavato reached down and touched the burlap. He looked at his wife, Vivina, and a silent communication passed between them. He then straightened up, his pride returning but transformed. He looked Amos directly in the eye and placed a hand over his own heart. It was a gesture of gratitude so immense and solemn that it needed no words. He then shouldered the bag, a burden that was now a blessing, and helped his wife turn. They walked away, the small boy still clinging to his father, their figures receding back into the vastness from which they came, leaving Amos Blackwood utterly and completely alone with the silence, the wind, and the empty space where his future used to be. The winter that followed was the crucible of Amos's soul. It came down from the north like a hungry wolf, teeth of ice and a howl of relentless wind. The snow fell and fell, burying his failed fields under a shroud of white, erasing the world until only his small, lonely cabin remained, a smudge of smoke against an endless, indifferent sky. With the seed corn gone, a strange and terrible clarity had settled over him. He had not just given away food, he had given away the mechanism of hope. His meager stores dwindled with alarming speed. The salted pork was gone by Christmas. The preserves Martha had put up the summer before she passed, each jar a sweet memory, were next. Soon he was down to a handful of dried beans and a little flour. Hunger became a constant, clawing companion. It sharpened the edges of his grief, made the silence in the cabin louder, deeper. Some days he would sit for hours, staring at the wall, the cold seeping into his bones, wondering if he had gone mad. "A fool's choice, Martha," he whispered to the empty room one night, the wind rattling the window pane like a restless spirit. "I gave it all away." He saw their faces in his mind's eye, the stoic man, the weary woman, the child. Had they made it? Or had his sacrifice been for nothing, a final, pointless gesture in a world that rewarded only strength? The doubt was a cancer, eating away at the certainty he had felt in that one, fleeting moment of connection. He had gambled his life on a stranger's gaze, and now he was paying the price. He grew thin, his clothes hanging loose on his frame. The work of the farm, already a struggle, became a monumental effort. Hauling water from the well left him breathless. Chopping firewood sent jolts of pain through his aching joints. The farm began to decay around him, mirroring his own decline. A fence post fell, and he left it. Shingles blew from the barn roof, and he watched them cartwheel into the snow-covered fields, too weak and too hopeless to repair the damage. He was a man coming undone, thread by thread. There were times he thought of taking the rifle and ending the slow, cold starvation. But the memory of Martha, faint as it was becoming, held him back. And something else, too. The image of Moketavato's hand on his heart. The solemn dignity in that gesture. He had made a choice. To undo it with an act of despair felt like a betrayal, not just of them, but of the man he had been for one brief moment on that cold autumn day. A man who chose compassion over calculation. So he endured. He rationed his last handfuls of flour, mixing it with snow to make a thin, tasteless gruel. He survived, but it was a half-life, a hibernation of the soul. Spring arrived, not as a gentle awakening, but as a slow, muddy retreat of winter. The snow melted, revealing the scarred and barren earth. The world turned from white to a dreary, uniform brown. For a farmer, spring should have been a time of frantic energy and boundless optimism. For Amos, it was a mockery. He stood on his porch, looking out at the vast, unplowed field that stretched before him. It was a blank page he had no ink to write on. The ground was hard-packed and stubborn. His plow was old, its blade dull. His single remaining mule was as gaunt and weary as he was. And even if he could summon the strength to break the earth, what then? He had no seed. The field was a monument to his folly, a vast and silent accusation. He felt a despair so profound it was like drowning on dry land. The fight had gone out of him. He had made his choice in the autumn, and this was the consequence, the end of the line. The farm would be reclaimed by the prairie, and he would simply fade away with it. He sank onto the porch steps, his head in his hands, the sun on his face feeling not like a warmth, but like a spotlight on his failure. He spent a week in that state of listless surrender. He'd wake, look out at the impossible task of the field, and feel the weight of it crush him back into inertia. He had given everything he had to see a family through the winter, and in doing so, he had ensured he would not see his own way through the spring. It was a bitter, lonely irony. It was on a morning like any other that his world changed for the second time. He was on the porch, nursing a cup of weak, bitter chicory root tea, staring at the endless brown of his field when he saw movement on the horizon. At first, it was just a dark line, a disturbance against the pale morning sky. Not a family this time. This was something else entirely. As the line grew closer, it resolved into riders. Dozens of them, then 100, then more. Amos's heart hammered against his ribs. His first instinct was pure, unadulterated fear. This was it. The stories he'd heard, the warnings, the deep-seated dread of the frontier. A war party. He scrambled inside, his hands shaking as he grabbed the rifle. He had no illusions. One man against how many? He peered through the grimy window. He counted until he lost count. It looked like 200 warriors, a river of men and horses flowing silently and inexorably toward his lonely farm. They were Cheyenne. He felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. Perhaps his act of kindness had been misunderstood. Perhaps it had been seen as weakness, an invitation. He was a fool, a dead fool. He stood behind the door, the rifle heavy and useless in his hands, and waited for the end. He braced for the sound of war cries, the thunder of hooves, the splintering of wood, but it did not come. The riders came to a halt just beyond the edge of his field, a silent, formidable assembly. The only sound was the jingle of harnesses and the soft snorting of their ponies. The air grew thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. Then, one man detached himself from the group and rode forward alone. As he drew closer, Amos's breath caught in his throat. It was Mokotavato. He looked different now. He was not the gaunt, desperate man from the autumn. He sat tall on his horse, his face serene and strong. He was not carrying a weapon. He stopped his horse 30 yards from the porch and dismounted. Amos slowly, cautiously, opened the door and stepped outside, leaving the rifle behind. He felt impossibly small and frail before the assembled host. Mokotavato walked toward him, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped before Amos, and for a long moment the two men just looked at each other. Then Mokotavato gestured with his chin toward the assembled warriors. "You have no seed," he said. His English was clear, practiced. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. Amos could only shake his head, a wave of exhaustion and confusion washing over him. "No," he managed to whisper. "None." Mokotavato nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. He turned and gave a sharp, clear call to the waiting men. What happened next would be seared into Amos's memory for the rest of his days. It was not an attack. It was a miracle. With a quiet discipline that was awe-inspiring, the warriors dismounted. They moved not with the chaos of a raid, but with the focused purpose of a seasoned work crew. From their horses, they unlashed tools. Some had brought heavy, horse-drawn braking plows. Others had hand plows, their wooden frames carried from their distant camp. They fanned out across his field, a silent army arrayed not for war, but for work. At another call from Mokotavato, they began. The silence was broken by the creak of leather, the grunt of men, and the rhythmic slicing of dozens of blades cutting into the hard-packed earth. They moved in long, straight lines, turning the soil with an efficiency that made Amos's own solitary efforts seem pathetic. They worked without conversation, a shared purpose moving them as one. The field that had been his personal symbol of defeat, an insurmountable obstacle, was being tamed, furrow by furrow, by the very people he had thought might be his end. Amos stood on his porch, stunned into immobility. He watched as the dark, rich soil was turned over, row after perfect row. He saw men who were warriors, hunters, men of the plains, stooping to a farmer's labor, their powerful shoulders bent to the task of plowing a stranger's land. It was an act of reciprocity so grand, so overwhelming, it shattered every preconceived notion he had ever held. This was not a debt being paid. A bag of corn for a day's labor was not an equal trade. This was a statement. This was a lesson in honor, a display of community, a testament to a promise kept not in words, but in deeds. Mokotavato stood beside him for a time, watching his men work. He pointed to a group of men who were not plowing but were unloading sacks from several pack horses. "We bring seed," he said simply. "More than you gave." Tears welled in Amos's eyes. He fought them back, but it was a losing battle. He looked at the Cheyenne leader, this man to whom he had given his last hope, and saw not a savage, not an enemy, but a man of profound integrity. "Why?" Amos choked out, the word thick with emotion. "Why all of this?" Mokotavato looked from the field back to Amos. He placed his hand over his heart, the same gesture he had used months before. "You fed my son," he said. "You fed my wife. You honored my family when we had no honor left. My people do not forget. A gift of life is answered with a gift of life. He gestured to the field, now more than halfway plowed. You will eat, your house will be strong again. This is our way. By late afternoon, it was done. The entire field, an acreage that would have taken Amos weeks of back-breaking, spirit-crushing labor, was perfectly plowed. The dark furrows lay neat and ready, waiting for the seed that now sat in heavy sacks by his barn. The 200 warriors gathered their tools, mounted their horses, and assembled once more into a silent, formidable line. They left as they had come, without fanfare. They flowed back into the prairie, a receding river of men, until they were once again just a dark line on the horizon, and then nothing. Amos Blackwood was left standing alone in the vast silence. But it was a different silence now. It was not the hollow silence of grief and loss. It was a resonant silence, filled with the echo of an impossible kindness. He stood before his plowed field, the scent of fresh earth rising to meet him, a smell he had once loved and then come to dread. Now, it was the smell of a future he never believed he would have. He walked down from the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, turned soil. He knelt and picked up a handful of the rich, dark earth. It crumbled in his palm, cool and full of promise. The weight of the past year, the crushing loneliness, the gnawing hunger, it all seemed to lift from his shoulders, carried away with the departing riders. He was no longer just a man grieving what he had lost. He was a man humbled and remade by what he had been given. He looked out at the vast expanse of the prairie, no longer an enemy, no longer a void, but a place of surprising, breathtaking grace. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over his field, over his home. For the first time in a very long time, Amos Blackwood looked toward the coming day, not with dread, but with a quiet, burgeoning hope. He had a field to plant, he had a life to live.